Hi, I'm Ellie Anderson, philosophy professor and co-host of Overthink podcast, here today to share some debates within philosophy around empathy. As with any topic, there's no way that I could possibly do justice to this within a short video, but I presented on this work before at a couple of places. I think the first time was at Utah Valley University and maybe in 2017. And so some of what I'm going to say here is going to draw from that presentation, but we also have a podcast episode of Overthink on empathy if you want to hear more. And of course, there's a really great wealth of literature out there that I would recommend checking out. In particular, I really like the edited volume Empathy by Amy Coplan, but I'll offer some other citations in addition during this presentation. So I want to just share some of what I gave in a more formal academic setting for the purposes of this video. In both academia and in public discourse today, you see what I call the empathy debates. On the one hand, empathy seems like an obvious good. It encourages us to put ourselves in other people's shoes, it can help us overcome in-group out-group bias, and it really helps us be more moral, better people. This group is what I call the pro-empathy camp. And I think in particular, neuroscientists' discovery of mirror neurons in the 1990s has been taken to suggest a neural basis of empathy. Marco Iacoboni has a 2009 book about this that has helped to catalyze the empathy camp in the years since. I know I was really deeply influenced a number of years ago by an episode of the Invisibilia podcast that talks about mirror neurons. At the same time, there is an anti-empathy camp as well, where there's an attention to research that shows that actually empathy does not decrease in-group, out-group bias. In fact, empathy destructively encourages us to think that others are like us, so it can actually paper over a lot of the differences between people and groups, and we often don't have empathy for those who seem to be really different from us. So there's a sense in which empathy, when we see people who are different from us, but not so different that we don't have any empathy for them, then we assimilate their opinions to our own or their feelings to our own. But then when it comes to people who are really different from us, we might actually, in fact, think that they are not deserving of empathy because they appear as so different. And some of the research involves, for instance, studies that show that individuals have more empathy for those who appear to be of their same racial or ethnic background, and that they have less empathy for individuals who belong to groups considered abject, such as those who are addicted to drugs or experiencing homelessness. So in the face of this, and I should say too that in this anti-empathy camp, the main figure is Paul Bloom, who has a 2016 book Against Empathy. But this debate between being for and against empathy, from a philosophical standpoint, needs some terminological clarification. Philosophers love to define our terms. We think it is very important. And so I think this leads to a question, which is, what is empathy? Because there is not a single accepted definition. Scholars have widely different definitions for empathy. For instance, Iacoboni defines it as the ability to share another's feelings. Amy Coplan defines it as a complex imaginative process in which an observer simulates another person's situated psychological states while maintaining clear self-other differentiation. So you can see that Coplan's definition of empathy is far more detailed than Iacoboni's, which means that she's probably going to define instances of empathy in a more delimited way than Iacoboni would. I also like, and you know this already if you've listened to my podcast or read my paper on sexual consent, returning to word origins and seeing what they have to tell us about the meaning of a word, even though, of course, we can only take that so far. But empathy actually has a really interesting history as a word. It only enters the English language in the early 20th century. The word empathy was coined in 1909 by the psychologist Edward Titchener as a translation of the German word Einfühlung, which means feeling into. And so Titchener wants to translate this German word Einfühlung, but he sees that we don't have a word for it in English. And so he invents this word empathy, I think probably in a riff off of sympathy. So it might seem like empathy has a Greek root, which sympathy does. Sympathy's Greek origin means to feel with, but actually empathy does not have a Greek root. Yeah, sure, it's drawing on pathos, the ancient Greek word for feeling, but you won't find the word empathy or like empatheia, an ancient Greek version of it, in any ancient Greek text because this guy coined it in 1909. But in fact, the German word Einfühlung is itself quite recent as well. It was coined by the philosopher Theodor Lipps in the late 19th century. And I think it bears mentioning here that Lipps originally coined the term Einfühlung as a description for the experience that we have of the work of art. So empathy did not originate as a word for how we encounter other people, but rather as a word for how we encounter art. And I think this origin of empathy suggests a couple of really interesting things. First, empathy is an aesthetic experience in the broad sense. Whether it involves perceiving another person or a work of art, it pertains to our senses, or aesthesis in the Greek. Second, both works of art and persons appear within the sensory field as expressive wholes that signify meaning. We'll see later on that this distinguishes these types of bodies from other entities in the world. So the methods that I'm using in general in a lot of my philosophical work, and certainly in my work on empathy, are the methods of phenomenology. And so this idea that the empathy signals the presence of an embodied whole is very similar to a lot of phenomenological views of how we perceive others. And Lipps's original theory of empathy serves as the direct basis for the line of thinking about empathy that I want to particularly draw our attention to, which is the phenomenological view. Phenomenology is a school of thought that was invented in the early 20th century in Germany by Edmund Husserl and was developed by other European thinkers, including Edith Stein, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and Simone de Beauvoir. Generally speaking, phenomenology is the study of lived experience, and it really involves patient ways of attending to the ways that we experience ourselves and environments as embodied, situated creatures. Phenomenology, I think, thus provides a really useful counterpoint to the scientific studies of empathy, which tend to dominate. Whereas the natural sciences presume a third-person objective observer, phenomenology emphasizes the indispensability of the first-person perspective. In addition, phenomenology has been studying empathy for over 100 years. This is long before scientists discovered the mirror neurons that sparked the new interest in empathy starting in the 1990s. And as a result, there are a lot of cognitive scientists who have come to acknowledge that phenomenology provides resources that enrich the inquiries of science. But I also think at the same time that dominant views of empathy in both the cognitive sciences and in analytic philosophy of mind haven't sufficiently taken seriously the challenges that phenomenology poses to their views of empathy. So I want to back out now and say a little bit more about how philosophers and cognitive scientists sometimes conceive of empathy, and then talk specifically about what I think phenomenology offers. So most scholars agree that empathy is experientially and logically grounded in a differentiation between self and other. So just because there are mirror neurons doesn't mean that there's no distinction between self and other. In fact, the very presence of mirror neurons shows that there is a distinction because I'm not actually doing the other's action for them. I am experiencing it in a sort of secondhand way through my mirror neurons. But a question arises then, which is, how does empathy allow us to experience the other as a conscious being with feelings? In order for a theory of empathy to prove convincing, it has to address the philosophical issue that is known as the problem of other minds. That is, how do I know that I'm empathizing with another person and not just an object in the world, say a robot? Who's to say that I'm not simply projecting my consciousness onto the other? Let's say that I grant that there are other consciousnesses. Even with that, important questions still emerge. How is it possible for me to experience these other consciousnesses? Isn't consciousness an essentially private, first-person affair? How do I move from the perception of another's body to the perception of their consciousness? And outside of the bubble of phenomenology, which actually takes some of these problems to be pseudo-problems, schools of thought among philosophers of mind and neuroscientists are divided into two primary camps on this set of questions. These are known as simulation theory and theory theory. Simulation theory suggests that we empathize with other people by simulating their situation and imagining what we would do if we were in their shoes. When another person smiles, I imagine he is happy because I smile when I'm happy. And this offers me a simulation of the feeling of happiness. Now, this simulation theory involves shifting perspectives. It also arguably requires a degree of knowledge about the other person. In order to simulate the scenario of a stranger who comes from a widely different cultural background than I do, I need to know a lot about that person's background. Simulation theorists thus often hold to the idea that empathy is a complex imaginative process, which is how we saw Coplan define it above. In opposition to simulation theory is theory theory. Theory, which is just such a great name, claims that the subject possesses a theory of mind. That is, a sense that the other body has a mind with thoughts, feelings, and other aspects of conscious awareness. A subject doesn't need to be explicitly aware of possessing such a theory of mind, but one nonetheless acts on the basis of it. Here, one infers on the basis of facing another person that the person, like oneself, has a mind. When I see someone smile, according to a theory theorist, I speculate that that person's smile is coming from a particular feeling that person is experiencing in the moment. And because I theorize that their consciousness is structured similarly to my own, I conclude that their smile indicates that they are happy, and I empathize with that feeling. Theory is thus sometimes equated with a form of mind reading, in which we interpret another's thoughts and feelings on the basis of the signs given by their body. There are a couple of relevant differences between theory and simulation theory. First, they're different in terms of the mental faculties that they take to be the primary mechanism of empathy. For simulation theory, the relevant faculty is the imagination. For theory, the relevant faculty is reason or cognition. Second, these views are different in terms of the perspective that they emphasize. Simulation theory emphasizes the first-person perspective. It takes empathy to involve putting oneself in the first-person perspective of the other. Theory emphasizes the third-person perspective. It takes empathy to involve speculation about what the other themselves might be experiencing. Because both views depend on an inferential model of self-other distinction, implying that empathy must overcome an originary gap between perceiving the other's body and perceiving the other's consciousness. The very premise that we experience other consciousnesses through inference, however, is misguided from the perspective of phenomenology. Because in phenomenology, we need to emphasize the embodied nature of consciousness, avoiding a mind-body dualism that would even make an inference necessary. In order to see how phenomenology unsettles the terms of the debate between simulation theory and theory, I want to investigate a little bit more the non-dualistic theory of embodied consciousness that I just mentioned. Phenomenology's answer to the problem of other minds is to say that there is no problem at all. Rather than needing to infer from another's body that she also has a mind, phenomenologists argue that others simply show up as consciousnesses in our perceptual field. It's only by projecting the intellectual assumption that there's a difference between bodies and minds that one worries about the existence of other consciousnesses at all. We might consider here the famous example from Descartes' Meditations, where Descartes looks out his window at the people in the street and wonders, and they're like wearing hats and coats, I think, and he wonders whether they might actually just be robots wearing hats and coats. There's nothing about their bodies, Descartes believes, that could guarantee that these others are not simply robots. One infers from the bodies of others that they are also minds, but nothing in the perceptual field guarantees this, because the perceptual field only pertains to bodies. For the phenomenologist, however, we can only separate mind from matter on the basis of having a preconceptual experience of minded matter. We need not decipher others' consciousnesses from their bodies. Rather, we encounter others as conscious bodies in our everyday life, all the time. Phenomenology emphasizes the way that our own conscious bodies are always situated within a broader social context of other conscious bodies. And this doesn't mean that we can't ever be wrong about consciousnesses. It could be that I think somebody is a person when in fact they are a robot, right? Or I might take a statue to be a person until I get close to it. But according to phenomenology, these possibilities of error are the exceptions that prove the rule. The idea that we don't need to infer minds from bodies, but rather experience others directly as embodied conscious beings, is what is called the direct perception account. The direct perception account draws on a distinction between two words for body in the German language. As I mentioned, phenomenology originates in Germany. And the first word for the body that we find in the German language is Körper, which is the term for the body taken as a material thing. It's related to the English word corpse, but it doesn't necessarily need to mean a corpse. It's like the body that the doctor treats. It's this third person perspective on the body. It is the body, from the outside, not seen as a dynamic thing, or rather seen as a thing at all. The second term in the German language is the Leib, which is the lived body. And the absence of this distinction in English, combined with our deep-rooted biases in favor of dualism, often means that we take bodies only in the Körper sense, and thus posit that humans must have both the body and something in addition, namely a mind or a consciousness. But taken as Leib, the body is in essence expressive and animated. It exhibits consciousness. Maurice Merleau-Ponty compares the lived body to a work of art. In appreciating a painting, we don't take it to be a physical object that additionally has meaning. Rather, we consider the painting to be an expressive whole in which meaning and material are intertwined. This same is true of our experience of other lived bodies. They are expressive wholes. And this notion of the lived body has significant consequences for thinking about how we experience others in empathy. The phenomenologist Juna Taipale emphasizes that there is a distinction between thinking that our experiences of others are conditioned by body perception and thinking that our experiences of them are mediated by our perception of our bodies. On Taipale's view, philosophers of mind have tended to conflate these two notions, when in fact they should be distinguished. It's uncontroversial to say that our experiences of others are conditioned by body perception. All this means is that we cannot directly experience others without experiencing them as bodies. But this doesn't necessarily mean that our experience of others are mediated by body perception. Because mediation suggests that the body is a sign of consciousness rather than being of itself conscious. This idea that the body is a medium easily lends itself to the impression that empathizing with another person constitutes a form of mind reading. But Taipale points out that the metaphor of mind reading takes the bodily expression of the other to be similar to a chain of words, that is, a sign that leads to meaning, but in which the meaning does not lie in the words themselves. Words by nature are arbitrary signs that signal beyond themselves to concepts. This is not the way that our experience of others works. The body of another does not signal to a consciousness beyond the body that I am meant to grasp into some disembodied mind. Rather, the consciousness is already present in person, such that there is no mediation required. Of course, you might be thinking here that this view leads to a huge problem, because claiming that the other is an expressive whole that is immediately accessible to our consciousness might lead us into the trap of thinking that we know what's going on inside someone else's head. If I experience the other's embodied consciousness directly, how do I explain the fact that the other person's feeling is her feeling rather than mine? And this is where I think phenomenology gets even more interesting, because it suggests that saying that I directly experience the other's consciousness doesn't mean that I experience her consciousness in the way that she experiences it. Rather, I experience her consciousness directly, but in the second person. And I'm going to read a quote from Edmund Husserl here, the founder of phenomenology, who says, "In empathy, the empathizing I experiences the consciousness of the other I. But no one will say he lives it and perceives it in inner perception, just like his own consciousness." End of quote. So in empathy, we don't feel the other's pain as our own. Rather, we do feel it, but as the other's. For Husserl then, empathy is precisely the experience that reveals the irreducible gap between one's ego and the ego of the other. There is no need to posit identification with or transparent awareness of the other's consciousness. The most developed view of this approach to empathy that we get in early phenomenology comes from the philosopher Edith Stein, who studied under Husserl and wrote her dissertation on the problem of empathy, which is a book I would definitely recommend checking out. It's super interesting. I think it was published in 1917. And I think a phenomenological view of empathy that is rooted in Stein's philosophy can really help set up or reveal the way that the stakes of the theory and simulation theory debate are misguided from the standpoint of inactive perception or embodied consciousness. Empathy is the experience of foreign consciousness in general. And so it doesn't require having the exact same experience as the other, but rather it does involve recognizing or feeling that they are a consciousness. I have another YouTube video about this, which is a mini lecture on Edith Stein's view of empathy. So I would recommend checking that out here, because I'm not going to repeat everything that I say there, but I will touch on a couple of other things. So following Stein's view of empathy, I, in the work that I've done on this, have developed a little bit of an updated view. I haven't published on it because I'm actually not sure if it's like that original or interesting, but it's something that I found helpful in articulating a phenomenology of empathy, which is that empathy is the feeling that aims at the feeling of another consciousness. This means that empathy involves a felt response to another conscious being, that this feeling is directed towards the feelings of the other, but it may or may not be isomorphic with the other's feelings, right? It doesn't necessarily have to involve the exact same feelings. And that empathy requires maintaining a distinction between self and other. It allows us to experience others as other. From a phenomenological perspective, empathy is fundamentally a perceptual experience. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that simulation theory treats the faculty of imagination as the most important faculty for empathy, and that theory treats cognition or reason as the vehicle for empathy. But according to phenomenology, empathy is already built into perception itself, such that we don't have to posit the intervention of one of these other faculties. Empathy is just a feature of our everyday perceptual life. I want to close by asking whether this view of empathy suggests that empathy is moral, which is what the pro-empathy versus anti-empathy camps that I mentioned at the beginning tend to debate. And I actually think that the answer is no, because empathy is a basic feature of our perceptual experience. Empathy is an aesthetic feeling, not essentially a moral one. This view highlights the embodied nature of consciousness. It also avoids problems of inference and dualism that hide behind simulation theory and theory. And it emphasizes the separation between self and other, suggesting that empathy does not require putting oneself in another's shoes. The experience of empathy is perceptual or aesthetic. And it is not in itself moral, but it could potentially aid in moral development in some cases.